Good morning class. Today we are going to study genetics. Genetics. So if we look at this topic, we find that this topic can be found in your class 12 NCERT book in unit number 7. And if we talk about the weightage of this topic, we see that this topic is very important for your class 12 as well as for your medical entrance exam. Almost 5 to 7 questions every year comes from genetics. If you look in your NCERT books, you see that this genetics and evolution, the topic in unit number 7, is divided into 3 parts. That is principles of inheritance and variation, molecular basis of inheritance and evolution. So today we will study the introductory part to principles of inheritance and variation. Okay. So firstly, genetics. What is genetics? What things are we going to encounter in genetics? So in genetics, we basically see the variation, the characteristics and why people are similar or dissimilar from each other. For example, in a daily life, we see that a dog gives birth to a puppy and a cat gives birth to a kitten, and it does not happen vice versa. Why? Why doesn't a dog give birth to a kitten and a cat doesn't give birth to a puppy? Also, if we see that we have some similarities which we have some similar characteristics which is equivalent to our parents, we have some characteristics which are dissimilar from our parents. Also, if we see in case of siblings, these characteristics are also similar and dissimilar. So why do characteristics vary in each and every individual? All these answers are provided by genetics. So to start with, what is genetics? Genetics is the collective study of heredity and variation. Genetics is the branch of biology which deals with the study of heredity and variation. So, what is genetics? Genetics is the study of heredity and variation. Now we see that there are two topics out here, that is heredity and variation. These two terms are very important key terms in genetics. Why? Because in the latter part of the chapters we will find repetitive use of heredity and variation. So it is very necessary to know the meaning of heredity and variation. So to start with, heredity. What do we mean by heredity? Heredity is the transmission of genetic characteristics from parents to offspring. That is, sometimes we find that if a patient is diagnosed with diabetes, he says that I got diabetes because my father had diabetes. Okay, some disorders like baldness. If a person is bald, he or she might say, my father was bald, my grandfather was bald, so I am bald. So baldness might occur due to the use of some chemicals, but sometimes it is also hereditary. So all these things, all the characters which are transferred from one generation to the next is termed as heredity. So what is heredity? Heredity is the transmission of genetic characters from parents to offspring. Also variation. Now what is variation? Variation means that sometimes we find that individuals of the same species are different from each other. Like dogs. Dogs belong to the same species, but there are some characteristics in dogs which make them different from each other. That is variation. So what is variation? In variation, individuals of same species different characteristics. Okay. So now we know what is the meaning of genetics. Genetics is the collective study of heredity and variation. Heredity is the transmission of genetic characteristics from parents to offspring. Variation, what is variation? Individuals or members of the same species have different characteristics. Okay, now genetics. So there would be some name of scientists which we cannot afford not to memorize. It is very important to memorize the name of the scientist. So now we will learn the name of the scientist who played an important role in the field of genetics. First comes the father of genetics, G.J. Mendel. So who is the father of genetics? I am writing it over here since this is very short, so it would be difficult for me to fill the space. So the father of genetics is G.J. Mendel, Gregor Johann Mendel. So what did Mendel do? In the early centuries, what did Mendel do? Mendel did some very important experiments which proved to be very useful in the field of genetics. But when he started to perform the experiments and came out with the results, nobody appreciated his work. Nobody found the importance of his work. Everybody thought that Mendel, the words of Mendel didn't seem much sense to them. But after 16 to 20 years of his death, when his work was getting modernized by Hugo de Vries and other scientists, they found that Mendel's contribution to the field of genetics is very useful. His experiments proved to be very useful. So after 16 to 20 years of his death, he was given the title of father of genetics. Now, who gave the term genetics? The term genetics was given by W. Bateson. So, W. Bateson coined the term genetics. W. Bateson. The word genetics comes from the Greek word genesis, meaning to grow into or to become. So, W. Bateson coined the term genetics, and the father of genetics is G.J. Mendel. Without Mendel, the study of genetics is not possible. So now we come to the names of some very important scientists. First is Bateson. What did Bateson do? William Bateson coined the term genetics. Also, William Bateson is known as the father of modern genetics. In spite of coining the terms genetics, he coined the term homozygous, heterozygous, allele, F1 generation and F2 generation. So, W. Bateson coined the terms homozygous, heterozygous, allele, F1 and F2 generation. On further studying, as we go through the details, we would know what are the meanings of these terms. But before that, let me introduce to these terms. After that, in the next phase, we will get an introduction to what these terms mean. Okay. So, Bateson was the father of modern genetics, and we coined the term genetics, homozygous, heterozygous, allele, F1 and F2 generation. Now the next scientist comes Morgan. What did Morgan do? Morgan is known as the father of experimental genetics. Father of experimental genetics. Why? As per the name, we can find that experimental means he definitely would have conducted many experiments. Yes, he did. He conducted his experiments on Drosophila. He conducted a lot of experiments on Drosophila and thus gave the concept of gene theory, linkage theory, sex linkage, crossing over, crisscross linkage, and linkage map of Drosophila. So these terms, students, might seem unknown to you, but don't worry, we will cover it in chapters. But for now, let's know the terms. So Morgan is known as the father of experimental genetics because he conducted his experiments on Drosophila melanogaster. Okay, to find out, and thus gave the concepts of gene theory, linkage theory, sex linkage, crossing over, crisscross linkage, and linkage map of Drosophila. Now the next scientist that we would encounter is A. Garrod. A. Garrod. What did A. Garrod do? A. Garrod is known as the father of human genetics and biochemical genetics. Father of human genetics and biochemical genetics. So what did A. Garrod do? A. Garrod was the first one to find out the genetic metabolic disorder in humans. He was the first one to find out a genetic metabolic disorder in humans known as Alcaptainuria. So what did he do? I am writing it over here. He found out genetic metabolic disorder in humans, okay, known as Alcaptainuria. What is Alcaptainuria? Alcaptainuria is also known as black urine. Okay, so what did A. Garrod do? A. Garrod was the father of human genetics and biochemical genetics. He was the first one to discover a genetic metabolic disorder in humans known as Alcaptainuria or black urine. Now the name of these scientists are very important to memorize. Okay. Now we come here. Now we now know the definitions of genetics, heredity, variation. Now it is time to know that what sort of variations exist. Variations exist is of two types, that is somatic and germinal or blastogenic. So variation is of two types. One is somatic and one is germinal or blastogenic. So what is somatic? The somatic variations are those sort of variations which are not inheritable from one generation to another. Okay, these variations are not inherited from one generation to another. So somatic generations are inheritable. Okay, now uninheritable. These sort of variations are uninheritable. Okay, now comes germinal or blastogenic. Germinal or blastogenic variations are inheritable. Okay, they can be inherited from one generation to the next. So germinal or blastogenic variations are transferred from one generation to the next. Now inheritable variation is of two types. One is continuous and one is discontinuous. Okay, so by the names we can find out that continuous variations are present in every generation without a gap. Okay, they are present in each generation, in first generation, second generation, third generation, they are present in every generation. Okay, And discontinuous variations are not present in every generation. There is a gap. If it is present in first generation, then it would be again inherited to third generation. Otherwise, if it is present in first two generations, a third generation would not reoccur discontinuous variations. So, continuous variation happens due to crossing over. And discontinuous happens due to mutations. So, continuous variation happens due to crossing over and discontinuous happens due to mutation. What is mutation? Mutation is a sudden change. So, discontinuous variations therefore occurs in gaps and continuous variation does not occur in gaps. Okay? Understood? So, now genetics. Genetics can also be divided into three parts. One is transmission genetics, one is molecular genetics, and another one is population genetics. So, genetics can be divided into three terms. The first one is transmission genetics. Transmission genetics can also be known as classical genetics or Mendelian genetics. Okay, classical or Mendelian genetics means it only deals with the transfer of characters from parents to offspring. Okay, and the second one is molecular genetics. Molecular genetics is due to the structure and function of genes at a molecular level. It deals with the structure and function of genes at a molecular level. And the third one is population genetics. Okay. Population genetics. Population genetics is it deals with the principles of Mendel and other principles of genetics. Okay, principles of Mendel and other principles of genetics which is applicable to the whole of the organisms. So now we know the three parts of genetics, that is transmission genetics, molecular genetics and popular genetics. We know the definition of genetics, what is heredity and what is variation. And now we also know the two types of variation, that is somatic variation and germinal variation. So till today we only know about the introduction and history part. In the next class we will know about the terms that we came across today and we will get a deeper insight into genetics. Thank you.